Good afternoon, and welcome, dear friends. I'm Maureen Raveno, and I serve Chautauqua as Director for Religion. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the amphitheater this afternoon as we conclude Week 4 of the 2021 Interfaith Lecture Series. Before this afternoon's lecture, I do have a few announcements. This summer, out of respect for our lecturers and continued public health concerns, we will not host public meet and greets for audience members following our Chautauqua programs. We thank you for your understanding, and it is our hope that this is a temporary measure and that we can resume this cherished tradition on the amphitheater's back porch very soon. We are pleased to offer live captioning for this program and for all of our Interfaith Lecture Series lectures as a service for those who have any kind of hearing impairment or who simply would like to have another way to follow along with our program. To view live captions during today's lecture, please visit captions.chq.org on any internet-connected mobile device. Captions for today's program will begin following these announcements. Lastly, out of respect for this afternoon's speaker and for all audience members around you, please silence your cell phones and refrain from using flash photography. And this concludes this afternoon's announcements. In addition to our in-person audience here in the amphitheater, we are pleased to welcome those of you watching and engaging with this program on our CHQ Assembly streaming platform, and we thank you so much for joining us. All who are with us live on CHQ Assembly are welcome to participate in the Q&A at the end of our program. You can submit questions at any point in the lecture via our question portal at questions.chq.org, via Twitter using the hashtag CHQ2021. Our amphitheater audience may also submit handwritten questions, which will be collected by our ushers at the close of the lecture. Today we conclude our Week 4 survey on our topic of the evolving religious narrative of America with Rabbi Dr. Gary Philip Zola, who is Executive Director of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives, the world's largest freestanding research center dedicated solely to the study of the American Jewish experience. Dr. Zola became AJA's second director in 1998, succeeding his teacher and mentor, Professor Jacob Rader Marcus, the prodigious scholar who first defined the field of American Jewish history and founded AJA. Dr. Zola also serves as the Edward M. Ackerman Family Distinguished Professor of the American Jewish Experience and Reform Jewish History at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati. He is known as an historian of American Jewry who specializes in 19th century American Judaism and the history of American Reform Judaism. Since 1998, he has been the editor of the Marcus Center's award-winning biannual publication, the American Jewish Archives Journal. It is truly our great honor to welcome and host Dr. Zola this week here at Chautauqua, and he's not a stranger. He has been here. We're so glad to welcome him back. His visit today being made possible by the Rabbi Samuel and Lynn Stahl Lectureship for the Understanding of Judaism. Dr. Zola's lecture is titled American Exceptionalism versus American Jewish Exceptionalism, Actualizing Religious Freedom in U.S. History. So now please join me in offering a very warm Chautauqua welcome on this little chilly day to Dr. Rabbi Dr. Gary Philip Zola.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very grateful, and it is a privilege and an honor to be here. Anyone who has studied the history of Jewish life in America knows about the Chautauqua Institution and its important influence on the history of Jewish life in this country. Now, as you heard from Maureen, it is true, I am a rabbi, and even though I have been institutionalized my whole career instead of a pulpitating rabbi, and as any good clergy, before I speak, I have something to say. So I want to begin by offering a few words of thank you. I want to express my words of gratitude, my heartfelt gratitude to my hosts here at the Chautauqua Institution who have made me feel so much at home. Of course, Bishop Robinson and Maureen Ravegno, I am so very grateful for all you've done. And I do want to add, even though you were kind enough to recognize Rabbi and Lynn Stahl, I do want to say that from the moment of my ordination in 1982, Rabbi Stahl has been a wonderful, kind, supportive mentor and colleague to me, welcoming me into the rabbinate and helping me every step of the way along my career. So I'm so honored and privileged to be here and to say a few words today under the banner of his name and Lynn's name. Thank you, Sam, for all you do. And in keeping, I know, with the sentiments that we all have, I think when I look out, having been here before and in this amphitheater, and knowing, of course, that a year ago it would have been hard to imagine us being able to assemble as we have, I want to begin with a recitation of what is for me my favorite prayer in all of the Jewish liturgy, a prayer that is probably close to 2,000 years old. It first appears in the early works of the rabbis. Some of you may know it. I'm going to just recite it in English. It is these words, praised are you, source of all, who has kept us in life, who has sustained us, and enabled us to live to reach this moment. I can't imagine a more appropriate word of prayer when we have been able to reassemble after the year and a half we've experienced. So, I want to tell those of you who may not know, I am certainly not the first rabbi to speak at Chautauqua. You all know that. It's not uncommon to have a rabbi speak in Chautauqua. But I do know who was the first rabbi to speak at Chautauqua, and that's this man, Rabbi Gustav Gottheil, who's a very interesting man. Rabbi Gottheil was born in Prussia, earned his PhD at the University of Berlin, studied to become a rabbi with one of the most radical reformers in Germany, a man by the name of Samuel Holdheim, left Berlin, where he was a rabbi, and became a rabbi for a period of time in Manchester, England, where he mastered English. And then towards the end of his career, he became the rabbi of the famous flagship Reform Jewish congregation in New York City, and that is Congregation Emmanuel. And he was friends with the bishop here, and I guess it would have been approximately 15 years after Chautauqua began. This man was the very first rabbi to speak here. We know quite a bit about it. We have his whole address. It was printed. And but before I turn to that, which I'll wrap up with that, I have found a little article that appeared in the New York Times about his appearance here, and I thought that it was very interesting and illuminating, and actually it gives a good introduction to what I wanted to share with you today. If you look on August 10th, this was only 4 days after the lecture here at Chautauqua. This appeared in the New York Times. It says, Rabbi Gottheil tells me that he is on intimate terms with the leading men of all denominations of Christians. A gentleman said to him here after his address that seeing the rabbi's name on the program, that is of Chautauqua, he urged some Jews of his city to go to Chautauqua to hear the address. But they said, no, this must be a mistake. Chautauqua would never allow a Jewish rabbi, of course, Jewish rabbis are the best kind of rabbis to have. Chautauqua would never allow a Jewish rabbi to speak from its platform. The gentleman thinks he will have the laugh on these unbelieving countrymen of Rabbi Gottheil upon his return home. So the fact is, this man couldn't wait to prove those doubting Jews that he actually did appear. I'm going to share with you what he said here. It'll be a good conclusion to my remarks. Now, the title of my talk today, what I wanted to share with you, is to talk a little bit about the topic of American exceptionalism and American Jewish exceptionalism. Now, the idea that America is inherently a different nation from all other nations in the world is a very important concept, a rich concept. It is also has many critics, this concept, and I can't get into the whole history of the term. It's a complicated story, but I do want to begin simply with the ideas of this man, very famous sociologist who taught at Stanford University, Seymour Martin Lipset, who is often considered to be someone who reframed the idea of American exceptionalism, and he essentially was teaching that, and this is in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, he basically was teaching that America is the first new nation. By that he means based on new ideas of the modern period, ideas that we all know and value, the ideas of liberty, equality before the law, individual responsibility, republicanism, representative democracy, and so forth. And this idea that America is special has its downside to it. It also has its upside, but it's basically this notion that America was established not out of a tribe, not out of a national unity, but rather based on an idea, and that the country has been aspiring towards this idea from its beginning. Now, American Jewish exceptionalism is an entirely different concept. And that concept is the idea that in all of the diaspora, there has been no place where Jews have had a better life, have had more opportunity, have had more equality, have come closest to the ideals upon which the nation takes pride, at least in terms of ideas of its founding, than in the United States of America. That throughout all of diaspora history, even in the great periods of our history, Jewish history in Spain and other places, never were the Jews able to achieve the level of integration and success as they have in the United States. And this is an exception. So why? What makes the American Jewish experience unique? And I'm going to offer you today 4 ideas, and I'm going to try to prove those ideas to you with documents. Now, I'm not going to argue that these are the only ideas, but I'm going to simply try to make the case that these are important ideas. So here they are. First, Jewish history in North America begins long before the dawn of the Republic. Jews were on this continent long before the Republic takes shape. This is highly unusual, wherein diaspora Jews have always wandered into a nation and been considered a guest. But the Jews have been here from the first organized Jewish community, as you can see, took place in New Amsterdam in 1654, and there's been a continuous Jewish communal presence with synagogues and so forth. They formed a synagogue in 1654, and there's been a community here ever since. Number two, Jews actually participated actively in the creation of the United States of America. That is, they were fighters in the war for independence. They were partisans. They contributed money. I put this famous stamp of perhaps the best-known Revolutionary War Jew, Chaim Solomon. Was honored with a stamp one year. This is very unusual. That is, the Jewish community is rightfully entitled to say we helped birth the American nation. Number three, very important to all of us, the Constitution itself asserts inalienable God-given rights that go to all men, and as everybody here knows, initially that's exactly what the founders meant, just men. And there's been, as Ivo Patel taught us on Monday, there's been a widening of that ideology, the attempt to move from what is to what we hope it will be. This famous picture here of Jonas Phillips, a Jew from Philadelphia, he wrote to the Constitutional Convention, he wrote to George Washington when the Constitutional Convention was being written, and he didn't know the Constitution the convention had already decided to make a separation between church and state. There would be no established religion. He didn't know that, so he writes, and he asks for that. He writes this is a very famous phrase that he asks the convention, as you can see, that they should be given equal footing under the law. He says, then the Israelites will think of themselves happy to live under a government where all religious societies are on equal footing. I solicit this favor for myself, for my children, and posterity, and for the benefit of all the Israelites throughout the 13 United States of America. He didn't know the convention and made that decision already, but it tells you what they were aspiring for. And the fourth unique feature, which creates this exceptionalism of the Jewish community in this diaspora community, is, of course, the independent judiciary. If we do not have an independent judiciary that can act in contrast to what the government may want to happen, if people do not have the right to appeal and to argue with City Hall and maybe to win, then it doesn't really matter what the Constitution says. I can show you the Constitution of the old Soviet Union. If you read it, you would think, my God, this is really on par with the U.S. Constitution. But if you don't have the right to prosecute your cause, then you don't have equal justice under the law. Now, I'm not going to be foolish enough to argue that there's equal justice under the law in every case, but that's what we're aspiring to, and that's what people fight for, right? Okay, so what then does this mean? It means that because of these four things, Jews have maintained from the beginning that we are Americans and we are Jews, and that there is no conflict between those two ideas. The way I teach it to my classes in Cincinnati is, if it's American, it's Jewish. If it's Jewish, it's American. By that I mean, in a try to be clever approach, is that there is nothing about being an American that makes it impossible to be a good Jew, and there's nothing about being a good Jew that makes it impossible to be a good American. And that has been an idea to which we have clung from the very beginning of our community. Let me now try to demonstrate three examples of this. First, because of this exceptionalism, Jews have said that Jewish citizens and Judaism as a religion itself possesses equal footing under the law. And the government of the United States should never prefer one religious tradition over another. You saw that in the letter I just showed you from Jonas Phillips. And on the basis of the Constitution, Jews have clung to this idea and have fought for it from the beginning. Number two, that Jews have not only the right but the duty to argue that both Jews who are United States citizens and Judaism around the world is entitled to the full protection of the United States government law, whether in the United States or abroad, and that Jews have the right to advance and advocate on behalf of their cause just like all Americans have the right to advance. So when farmers band together in order to advance the cause of their profession, or when other interest groups join together to lobby for causes that are important to them, as full citizens, we have that same right and duty as good citizens of the United States. And finally, the third point is that since the U.S. Constitution posits that there is a delicate balance between majority rule and minority rights, and that there are certain things that the Constitution will not allow the majority to trample upon, Jews have from the beginning been very interested in minority rights for themselves and for others. So you know how it should work, at least in this country, is that you have elections, people vote, the majority should add up, and people who have the majority win. However, there are certain things in the Constitution that you cannot take away from a person, that are granted and that cannot be voted out unless the Constitution itself is changed and amended. So, to protect the rights of minorities, even in a country with majority rule, has been of interest to the Jews, and I'm going to demonstrate these 3 points with documents as quickly as I can and leave time for questions. That's at least my ambition. So let's go to point number 1, which, as I said, is that the Jews have from the beginning argued that Jewish citizens and Judaism itself possesses equal footing under the law, and the U.S. government must never advantage one religion over another. I found this document when I was working on my PhD. I've now recently published it, but I loved it. My PhD was on the Jews of Charleston, and I'm sitting looking through newspapers. This was in a period of time when I didn't have the advantage of digitized newspapers, and I was looking for Jews in Charleston in the early 1820s. You can see this is from 1827. And I come upon the name of Cohen, and I, brilliant student that I was, I said, that sounds like a Jewish name. So I start to read the article, and I realized I had a treasure, and I'm going to read it to you. You follow along. Having had a dispute with Dr. Edward Chisholm and feeling myself insulted by an illiberal expression made by him, I applied to a gentleman of respectability and honorable feeling to call on Dr. Chisholm and to demand an apology. If this was not promptly given, then to demand the only redress that honor has long established as the practice in these cases. Anyone want to take a guess what this Jew, Mr. Cohen, is fighting for? A duel. That is correct. He's a Southerner, and as you can see, this Dr. Chisholm has insulted him, and he demands an apology. And if Dr. Chisholm won't give an apology, then Mr. Cohen wants to fight for a duel. However, as you read on, it says, Dr. Chisholm, through his friend, answered that he would give me no satisfaction and that I was not on a footing with him because I was a Jew. Nor did he conceive any Jew to be on equal footing with him. As such a subterfuge as this marks the individual not only with illiberality but ignorance and cowardice, it therefore becomes my painful duty to intrude these remarks on the public in order to expose him to the community in which I live the place of my nativity. So the poor guy has no redress, so he has to actually buy an ad in the newspaper to complain. Now comes the most important paragraph, and it is illustrative of the fight that Jews have brought to this country to keep the nation on the path from the real to the ideal. And he says, and this pay attention to, please, the Constitution of the United States and my native state give me and every citizen of every religious denomination equal rights and equal privileges. Religious distinctions are not known in this country. Ha ha. Members of the same community are valued only according to their conduct in life, and none but a bigot and a coward like Edward Chisholm would attempt to insult a whole nation by refusing that satisfaction which every gentleman is ready to give and to receive. Now you please note how this illuminates what I've been trying to teach you. First of all, it's based on the Constitution. The Constitution entitles this. Number two, notice that he speaks not only for the Jew, but he says of every citizen, of every religious denomination. And this is my theme, friends, that the Jew has uniquely been positioned because of the length with which we've been here, because of the 4 points that I made, to be the advocate for bringing the nation closer and closer to the ideals, or as my teacher used to put it, the Jew has played a remarkable role in helping our nation to live up to and to guide it to reach the lofty aspirations enshrined in our founding documents. Here's an interesting man by the name of Jacob Ezekiel. I'd love to be able to teach you this in great length. Jacob Ezekiel, born in America, born in the city of Philadelphia, brotherly love. He makes his life in the city of Richmond, Virginia. And very interesting. Glad we have someone from Richmond. And he had a congressman. His congressman in Richmond, Virginia was a man by the name of John Tyler. Some of you may recognize that name, especially if you know the name Tippecanoe. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So some of you know that he was the running mate of William Henry Harrison. And some of you also know that William Henry Harrison was the oldest president elected up till President Ronald Reagan. And got a lot of teasing about being an elderly general, and so he decided he'd prove his machismo by speaking for 2.5 hours at his inauguration in 1841. You all know that. Of course, any rabbi knows, and there are plenty of rabbis in this crowd today, any rabbi knows that if you decided to speak even on the high holy days for more than a half hour, you'd be dead too. But the president didn't know that. He spoke for 2.5 hours in a driving storm. He had pneumonia the next morning. And as you know, for 30 days he lingered. He never really fulfilled one significant act of the presidency. And for the first time in American history, John Tyler succeeds from the vice presidency to the presidency. And this letter, which you may be able to see up top in 1841, is a letter from my friend Jacob Ezekiel in Richmond to his former congressman, John Tyler. What's he writing about right after the death of the president? Well, Tyler's very first proclamation was, he says to the American people, I want you to all go to the house, to your houses of worship, and to say prayers of sorrow and lamentation for the fallen president. And then he makes this fatal error, at least in the opinion of Mr. Ezekiel, because he says, the president says, we must do this because we are a Christian people. So Mr. Ezekiel sees this and he reads the letter. I'm only going to read you one little paragraph there, and so you can see. I'll blow it up and I'll read it to you. He says, I, as well as others, were somewhat surprised to find in the columns of our journals in the age in which we live that the chief magistrate of this union should by official recommendation to the people of the United States address, quote, a Christian people as being overtaken by a great public calamity, no doubt forgetting that during the revolution of this country, blood of all denominations was shed for its freedom. In those days, there was no distinction. It was not asked whether it was Christian, Jewish, or pagan blood that flowed freely for the liberty we all now possess. Once again, a historian can say anything, but you must be able to prove your assertions with documentary evidence. So I'm now bringing you a second example of what I've been trying to say. You notice again, he goes back to the War of the Revolution. The Jews were here, and yet he doesn't stop and say, so therefore worry about the Jew. He involves all denominations in his appeal. So I'm going to keep moving because I don't want to. Any of you know who this gentleman is? Good. That's right. This is Father Charles Coughlin. Some of you must know, therefore, that in the 1930s, Father Coughlin, the famous radio priest, had made up his mind that most Jews in America were socialists and communists, and therefore not true Americans. And he becomes the boogeyman of the American Jew in the 1930s, a very difficult period for a bigotry toward the Jew. You can hear him yourself.
I dared you and challenged you to organize so that the people, if not the president, would drive the money changers from the temple, and you did it. You appreciate the fact, my dear friends, that among other things in the National Union for Social Justice, we are Christian insofar as we believe in Christ's principle of love your neighbor as yourself, and with that principle, I challenge every Jew in this nation to tell me that he does not believe in it.
That was 1937. So now I'm bringing you an example of how, just like Ezekiel and just like Mr. Cohen, a 20th century example, this is a picture of Rabbi Stephen Wise, one of the most important and famous Jews of the 20th century, a prominent leader in so many ways. I don't have time to detail all of his accomplishments, but his congregation did not have its own building. They had Sunday services every single Sunday from 1910 until 1949 at Carnegie Hall. And that hall was filled with not only his own congregants, but members of the community. And he regularly fought back against Coughlinism. I'm going to play a rare clip. We have a collection at the American Jewish Archives of recordings of Stephen Wise from the 1930s and 1940s that exist nowhere else in the world, and they've been brought back to life. I wish I could tell you the details of this, but I'm going to play this for you. You're going to be transported now 80 years back into history, and imagine yourself in the pews of Carnegie Hall and listen to precisely how he contradicts Coughlin. And these recordings were made in order to play them on the radio.
Coughlinism is the deadliest form of anti-Semitism in America today. And it is that because it is anti-democratic, because it is as anti-Semitism always is anti-American. Evasions, sophistications will not answer the charge. Coughlinism is another name for anti-democratic, anti-American, anti-Semitism. Coughlinism resorts to a cheap and contemptible trick which must not deceive and entrap the unwary. Coughlinism lifts up its voice not to condemn, not to protest, but to explain, to argue, to extenuate. True Coughlinism has not explicitly and frankly defended anti-Semitism or Nazism in Germany. It would if it dared. If it dared to affront the conscience of American mankind, it would. It lacks the courage of such unpopular convictions as it has. It implies there is or there may be an excuse for Hitlerism. That excuse is communism. Communism and its menace. And Jews, he adds or implies, are or were the communists in Germany. For the Jew, Coughlinism is a regrettable phenomenon. For the Catholic Church, it is a disaster. But above all, it is America's shame.
It's very important to remember that there are very few places in the course of Jewish diaspora history. What I mean by that, of course, is outside of its own nation state, where Jews had the ability to speak in this fashion, and that it would be carried from the pew to the American public, as it was with Rabbi Wise. I have to move on because I see tempest fugit. So my second point that I said, which made American Jewish exceptionalism, is that as citizens of the United States, Jews and the Jewish religion itself, the Jewish experience, was entitled to full protection of the United States law anywhere in the world. I'm only going to bring you one example of this because of time. It has to do with the famous financier Jacob Schiff. Some of you may know that name. Schiff was born in Frankfurt and immigrated to the United States right after the Civil War in 1865, and he becomes a very successful banker. He enters into the banking business, and then from banking he becomes a financier, and he plays a role in helping to finance and develop so many important American initiatives and initiatives in other parts of the world. And he is one of the founders of the American Jewish Committee, which is an organization founded in 1906 in order to advance the cause of Jewish rights and so forth in the United States. And you're looking at a quote that the premier of Russia printed some years after he met Schiff, and I just brought it because you can see he says, "My God, I've never met a Jew in Russia like Schiff." I mean, you know, where would he meet a Jew like that in Russia? I mean, you couldn't behave like that under the Tsar. He says, proud, dignified, conscious of his power. Well, he was an American Jew, even though he was an immigrant to the United States. He had Americanized and then became a naturalized citizen. And the Jews were in the United States began to advocate in the turn of the century, when the Russians really became very brutal to the Jewish community of Russia, and there were pogroms, riots against the Jews, and the Jews in the United States began to advocate to the United States government to act on behalf of the cruelty and the anti-American behavior of the Russians at that time. And one of their initiatives was to try to abrogate a treaty that had been in existence between the United States and the Tsarist Russia for many years. And in 1911, finally, that treaty is being considered for abrogation by the government. And here at a hearing of the committee of the House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs, a group of Jews testify as to why this treaty should be abrogated. And Schiff, as you can see, is one of the prominent citizens who speaks there. And I'm going to read to you from the record, the congressional record. I want you to listen to how this man speaks in front of Congress in the year 1911. You can follow along as I read. He says, "Now, gentlemen, this is a chestnut that has come down through the centuries. This question has always been the same, in the same position at the end of every administration. Every administration has claimed that it has done the best that was practicable, but that has not been the case. The best that was practicable was never done, and whatever has been done has not been done at the time that it should be done. The best that is practicable is to honor and vindicate the dignity of the American people as against Russia and all that Russia stands for. Now, gentlemen, just think of this. If any of you who may happen to confess the Jewish faith, any American who accidentally was born of Jewish heritage, wants to go to the Far East today and wants to take the shortest route, he has to take the Trans-Siberian Railroad. When he comes to the Russian border, he's told no thoroughfare. Now, just think of it, gentlemen. Just think of what it means to be an American. In 1914 or 1915, our Panama Canal will be completed. That great contribution which the American people are making to civilization and the civilized world. That will then be open to the commerce of the world. Let us suppose that a Russian steamer comes through the gates of the canal, and it may be told, you cannot pass through. What a howl there would be on the part of the civilized world. Do you see the simile? Are you going to stand for this? Gentlemen, I have finished. I have only this to beg of you in conclusion. I have little fear that a committee composed as this committee is composed of high-minded men, of what the report of this committee will be. But if you wish to vindicate the dignity of this Congress, the dignity of the American people, then make your report unanimous." Now, by the way, the committee then voted to abrogate the treaty, and this was one of the major first political successes, lobby successes of the American Jewish Committee. That treaty was abrogated. The last thing I have to quickly get to is the third point, which is our Jewish concern in this country to have the nation be attentive always to the value of minority rights through the Constitution. And I have 2 or 3 things I want to show you. I may run into my time a few minutes, 5-6 minutes. Some of you know this book. I had to read it in high school. Richard Wright's very famous book, A Native Son. In a nutshell, for those of you who haven't read it, this was on the top of the bestsellers list in 1940. African-American author who writes the story. It's a fictional story, but based on America, of the life of an African-American by the name of Bigger Thomas. And the book shows the difficulties that this man had as a result of being a black man in America. And he ends up accidentally trying to rob someone. He's caught in the middle of this robbery, this Bigger Thomas in the book, and this woman he runs into, he's robbing her house, starts to scream, and he wants her to stop screaming. He puts a pillow in front of her mouth, and as a result of that, she's killed. And he now goes to trial and is likely to lose his life for murdering a white woman. And the book, this black author creates the character of a Jewish lawyer. The Jewish lawyer in the book says there is no doubt that this man is going to fry, because if there's anybody in America that the jury is going to like less than an African American, then it's a Jewish lawyer. And in fact, that is what happens in the book. He gives a noble defense of Bigger Thomas, but the jury convicts him. This book is very popular in America, is read all over, and our friend Rabbi Stephen Wise, like any clergy person, decides to give a book review on it in 1940. I want you to listen carefully to what he tells his congregation in Carnegie Hall, 3,500 people, about Native Son.
To me, as I read Native Son, the word and the mind and the understanding and compassionate soul of the Jewish lawyer became to me at one and the same time symbol, rebuke, prophecy, challenge. Symbol of what the Jew should be and do in relation to other races that are oppressed and ground into the dust. And I remember the very sage and shrewd observation personally made to me a generation ago by Israel Zengin and repeated in one of his last volumes. If only the Jews could forget their own fate, however bitter, and remember and try to better the fate of another, some alien race, such as the Negro race. After all, we Jews, as no other people, we know the heart of the oppressed. And I can't help saying to you, if there be any Jews in this congregation today who hail from the South, they are likely profoundly to disagree with me. But I must speak the truth as I see it. The indifference of the Jew, child of 35 centuries of civilization, his own. The indifference of the Jew throughout the country, save for rarest exceptions, to the fate of the Negro race is deeply dishonoring to the Jew. I feel a double obligation to every oppressed race and to every wronged man on earth. For I am an American and I am a Jew.
I'm going to move us forward, but I love that line. I feel a double obligation to every wronged man, every oppressed nation, because I am an American and I'm a Jew. And again, you see what Rabbi Wise is doing. He's calling out to the Jewish community and saying, it's your obligation. Nobody understands being a minority better than the Jews. Nobody understands oppression better than the Jews, so you need to be concerned about the African American. Don't simply say to yourself, we have our own problems. This I could illustrate again and again. I'm going to shortcut because I want to leave time for questions, but the whole period of civil rights, it's well known, it's been documented that Jews were highly overrepresented during the civil rights period in the 20th century in terms of white participation. Some of you already have in mind Schwerner and Cheney and Goodman and so forth. But I do want to just show two last clips, and with that I'll bring things to an end. Let me just skip ahead. I think all of you know, or many of you will remember, of course, the terrible blast that took place in September 15th or 16th in 1963. 4 children were killed in Birmingham, playing in the church. The KKK put a bomb against the wall. This really raised the nation's attention to the calamity that was going on in terms of civil rights in America at that time. And this was only a few days before the High Holy Days. The Rabbi of Birmingham, Rabbi Milton Grafman, here's a picture of Rabbi Grafman. He had a button on his pulpit he could record himself. So we have that sermon. And what I'm not playing for you is he begins by saying, in all my years in the rabbinate, I've never not delivered the sermon I've written for the High Holy Days. But today I'm speaking to you from my heart. And here's what he says.
Where were you yesterday afternoon at 3:30? I'll tell you where I was. I was the 6th Avenue Baptist Church, Negro. I was at that funeral. I'm no hero. Anybody knows me, I'm no hero, I'm no martyr. I don't want to get killed, I don't want to have this temple bombed, and I don't want my home bombed. 4 children had been brutally killed. All we wanted to do was to go there and express our grief and our sorrow, to show these Negro families that we felt the depth of their sorrow, we shared it. All we wanted to do was to say to the Negro community, you're not alone. There are white people. This was all.
Now, I know that at Rabbi Stahl's congregation on the High Holy Days, there are as many people on the High Holy Days attending as there are on every Sabbath. But I'm here to tell you that in most synagogues, that's not the case. So what you see happening here is Rabbi Grafman is talking mostly to people he sees just twice a year. And here's another example of, in the Deep South, of the rabbi saying, you must pursue this. You should have been there where I was. Now, the last clip I'm showing you, and with this I end, is the most famous of all, but many of you probably have never seen it. It has to do with the March on Washington. Some of you know that many organizations co-sponsored Dr. King's very famous march in 1963 in August, and also there were Jewish organizations that did so. The president of what was called the American Jewish Congress was this very famous rabbi, Rabbi Joachim Prinz. Rabbi Prinz was born in Berlin. He was ordained in Berlin. He was the leader of a Berlin liberal congregation, and he was exiled from Berlin because of the Nazis. He comes to New Jersey, where he becomes the rabbi in Newark, and he works his way up in the American Jewish Congress. He becomes the president, and he leads the Congress into civil rights activities, and he is invited to speak at that very famous March on Washington. Many people don't know that he spoke literally right before Dr. King. And had it not been that Dr. King gave such an iconic address that has become one of the most famous addresses in all of American history, maybe Dr. Prinz's words would have been better known. But you're going to get to hear them. With this, I conclude. This is the most important message because it embodies the whole drive of American Jewish exceptionalism. These are pictures. You see the organizers joined together at the feet of Abraham Lincoln. You can see a young John Lewis in these pictures, along with Dr. King and with A. Philip Randolph and Walter Reuther, Roy Wilkins, president of the NAACP. They went to see President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson. You see Rabbi Prinz right up front next to Dr. King. Now you'll hear the 3.5-minute address by Dr. Prinz right before King's speech.
I speak to you as an American Jew. Our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. Our Jewish historic experience of 3,500 years began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime. I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent, not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the dream, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. Our children, yours and mine, in every school across the land, every morning pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands, and then they, the children, speak fervently and innocently of this land as a land of liberty and justice for all. The time, I believe, has come to work together For it is not enough to hope together, and it is not enough to pray together, to work together, that this children's oath pronounced every morning from Maine to California, from north to south, that this oath will become a glorious, unshakable reality in a morally renewed and united America. Thank you.
Well, friends, that's what I mean by American Jewish exceptionalism. And now you heard Rabbi Prinz say, it's not only for the Jew, it's not only for the African American, it's for the dream, the ideal, the aspiration of what America itself could one day be. I promised you I would tell you what Rabbi Gottheil said in 1891. It should be the best way to end. He concluded his address right here on this ground, breathing this air, saying these words: I believe this Chautauqua is a very good foretaste of the things to come, and that the light of its influence will spread to the length and breadth of this land. And though it may be, perhaps long after we have gone to our rest, it may still be remembered that on this day really commenced the grander day when all the walls of separation were finally broken down between the Hebrews and this good and great nation, upon whom I pray God may send that blessing promised to those who receive the last of the lowly. Let's make good on Rabbi Gottheil's prayer as we move forward. Thank you for your kind attention.
Rabbi Dr. Zola, you have so inspired us and so reminded us, whether we are Jewish or other, not Jewish, whatever we may be, you have so reminded us of who we need and want to be, the best of whatever America has ever aspired to be, whether it's American exceptionalism or Jewish exceptionalism, American Jewish exceptionalism. And I just think you have done a great deal to remind us of what we also need to be addressing in our own contemporary world in so many ways.
Thank you.
So, reminding in the words of Rabbi Gottheil about tearing down walls. We have a lot of that to do in our world. But there's a lot underlying all of the history that we have all imbibed and become so much a part of the DNA that we don't want to have be there, the shadow side of who we are. So we have a question that will connect back to yesterday's lecture, and I'm so glad that you've been here this week. So yesterday's excellent interfaith lecture, the writer says, implicated Christianity in its historic role in white supremacy and in Christian supremacy. And today you've shared with us about Coughlinism and the hateful rhetoric, the insidious implications that caused in our country. And I'm wondering, when you were listening to the lecture yesterday, were there any associations that you were making with regard to the doctrine of discovery and the way those underlying kind of negativities show up, especially in something as blatant as Coughlinism? Were there any associations that you were making?
Well, I would say no. I'm not sure that I was. Now that you asked the question, I can see, for example, that a Jewish historian, if you reflect back over the whole course of Jewish history, you can't help but recognize that the blending together of governments and of Christian religious life, which become one and the same, had, to say a profound effect on the history of Jewish life is an understatement. I wasn't so much thinking about the documents of discovery, but I suppose all of us who are cognizant of Jewish history recognize that the superiority of Christian denomination over the course of the years certainly influenced Jewish life around the world. By the way, that also happened in terms of Islam when Jews lived under Islamic rule. That's why, friends, the return of Jews to their own nation state in 1948 has been considered by Jews around the world to be so miraculous, because it returns the Jewish people to a sense of normalcy where it has its own nation just like all the peoples in the world. So that's the best I can do on that.
So it's not on the mind of another questioner who was remarking, didn't Franklin Roosevelt call America a white Protestant Christian, parentheses, not simply a Christian, nation, the same time that Father Coughlin was giving his anti-Jewish remarks? And what implications or ramifications would have been from those connections?
Well, many people here know that Franklin Roosevelt was a great hero to the Jews. Now, in historical hindsight, his presidency has been revisioned. Questions have been asked as, did President Roosevelt do everything that could be done to help the European Jews who were being slaughtered by the Nazis? But what I would say is, and this is true of everything in history. History is very complicated, and when you start to tell one story by nature, you're leaving out another, and that was pointed out yesterday and also on Monday, and that's true. In other words, let me say this: Roosevelt, he did say that. But Roosevelt also appointed more Jews to his cabinet and gave Jews more of a role. He depended upon, Jews had a greater opportunity under his presidency than they had in previous presidencies. So there's two sides. I mean, to almost, well, many more than two sides, lots of sides to all history. I guess I should also confess that not all the Jews in the history of the United States were as noble as the people that I decided to highlight today. There were Jewish segregationists, there were Jewish traitors, there were Jewish, like all people. But when I say there were Jewish segregationists, I wanted to tell today the story of what I think was the more dominant theme in American Jewish life, and that is the concern with overall, I think it can be argued and proven with historical documents that Jews were concerned with minority rights, not only for themselves, but as I've tried to demonstrate, for the betterment of the nation.
And you did beautifully. Thank you so much. So another question about Coughlinism. How much of a following was there to Coughlinism, and was there a pushback from others besides the rabbi? And I think you just answered that.
Yeah, oh, well, Coughlin, I refer to Coughlin. I mean, first of all, there's 3 or 4 excellent books on the history. For those of you who are interested, Voices of Protest is one title. There's 2 or 3 others, excellent histories on Coughlin. And, I refer to him as he's really the father of talk radio today. I mean, he really was. I mean, he begins in 1926. He founds this little church outside of Detroit. He's got a beautiful, mellifluous voice, magnificent preacher. And someone in the congregation says, why don't you read your sermons that you deliver on Sunday morning, beautiful sermons, into this radio, the local radio in the afternoon, and you can raise funds to help build your church. And that's how it gets started. And then it's networked. And by the time the 30s roll around, this is now about 1927, the networks join together and he becomes a national figure. There's more than 20 million people who listen to him. He was a very influential figure. I mean, just like many of the radio personalities today. And he had his enemies and he had his opponents, and they weren't just Jews. Eventually he's forced off the air. But he was a major opponent for many years.
So there's great concern coming from our audience about anti-Semitism.
Yes.
So here are 3 questions that I think you can answer all simultaneously. Why is anti-Semitism resurging again worldwide? Another, why is anti-Semitism so persistent? Your perspectives and ideas, please. And what do you suggest an American Jew can do to not be quiet as we see the rise of anti-Semitism? Why is this increasing all over the world? Great concern here.
Well, I did anticipate some question of that sort, and I've given it some thought. It's often said that anti-Semitism is the oldest hate. And I don't know if that's the case or not, but it certainly is a very old hate. And believe it or not, when you study anti-Semitism, of course anti-Semitism is an anachronistic term, because you really can only talk about anti-Semitism starting in the late 19th century. But if you want to broaden it to Judeophobia or anti-Jewishness, this goes back, believe it or not, long before the rise of Christianity. It goes back to the Roman period and before. There are people who have argued, and I'm inclined to believe it, that it is like the canary in the mine, that it reminds humanity when it expands that we're running out of oxygen. And that it should be a warning, not just to Jews to do something. It should be a warning to all of us. Here, Rabbi Prinz's message, I saw a number of you applaud. It's obviously a timeless message. His point that the worst thing about the great German culture during World War II was worse than the brutality, worse than even mass murder, he says, was silence. And so I think that what can be done about anti-Semitism is what Jews, I believe, it's been pointed out by the famous British historian that in history, we face challenges, and it's not the challenges we should only dwell on, but focus on the response to those challenges. That's what history is made of. That's what lingers on. What are the responses? So for all of you who are here today, you've seen example after example of challenges that individuals have faced and that the nation, Jewish people, have faced, and then the response by Mr. Cohen, by Rabbi Wise, by Mr. Ezekiel, and so forth and so on. So I'll end with this. There's a beautiful rabbinic legend that appears in the Talmud. My colleagues here know it. It's very famous. The rabbis of yore asked this question: what does the Eternal One do all day long? And they answer their own question. The Eternal One does three things, they say. The Eternal One studies, the Eternal One dispenses kindness, and the Eternal One then nourishes the world. So this is a good model, imitatio Dei. Let us imitate this image of the Eternal One. Let's continue to study. The archives proves to us how valuable it is to preserve the past so that we can learn from the past, not because the past repeats itself, but we don't want to repeat the past. We don't want to repeat the mistakes that we make. And if you preserve these and study the past, it can be a guide to inspire us to a better future. Let us dispense kindness in everything that we do every day. If we do that, we will drive out the darkness. And finally, let's try to nourish our world, as that famous Baptist hymn puts it, brighten the corner where you are. And if you do that, I'm convinced, based on history and based on my own spiritual belief, that we will overcome this difficult time we're facing, all of us together. Thank you so very much.
Rabbi Dr. Zola, we thank you so much for all your work and everything you do. You are living up to the Jewish intention to heal the world, Tikkun Olam, and we thank you so much. Let's really show our appreciation.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.